So this is a great transition actually, because I'm going to talk about open source developments for games, not on chain, but I do agree with Will that it's very hard. So this is more of an after action report, but the action is still ongoing. First, very quickly, who am I? As I've been introduced as, I'm the CTO of Brick. We're doing something that I'm going to describe myself as digital Lego and not digital Minecraft, but it looks a lot very similar. It's on StarkNet. It's an NFT project. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm also, and more relevantly, one of the core team devs of Zero AD, which is something I'm going to talk about in the next slide. Background in data analytics, data science, and I'm a big gamer, RTS, city builders, driving sims mostly. Driving sims are not going to go on-chain anytime soon, so I've resorted to more RTS games. So what is Zero AD and why can I talk about open source development? Zero AD is, well, I think it's the biggest fully open source game. It's a GPL v2 game. It's like the actual open source that doesn't make any money, which is why I can talk about this, because this is not shilling. The project has lived for 20 years and we've made exactly $0 on it. It plays like Age of Empires, though to be honest, Age of Empires is a much better game. It's written in C++, OpenGL, Vulkan, JavaScript, all the tech you'd expect from a 20-year-old project. You can do fun things like fixing bugs that have been written in the code 15 years ago. That's like, for a developer, very satisfactory, though you always wonder if it's a bug or a feature. That haunts me at night sometimes. It's a huge code base, 150 lines of code approximately, and we have no clue how many people we have playing it. But, quite a few still, particularly for an open source game. And so myself, I've contributed to that project for 12 years, been part of the core team for about 10. Went through 4 different project leads, including none at several times, which is why I know it's hard. And we've had at least one hostile fork, which is something that people tend to discuss when they're talking about on-chain stuff, on-chain autonomous worlds in particular. They talk about forking. And it's always kind of a theoretical thing. Oh, you can be forked. Well, I've been forked and yeah, nothing too much happened, but I know that it doesn't feel great, to be honest. So when people say, you can just fork, I'm like, do you really want to though? Probably not. Just to show you what it looks like, because it's a bit more, it's easier to visualize. This is the game. But those screenshots look really good, to be honest. But it's an RTS, you know what an RTS is. Anyways, so one thing I think is interesting when we're talking about open source is that developing a game in an open source fashion is, in and of itself, kind of an autonomous world. And I'm going to draw completely uncontroversial parallels here. I'm using 4 elements that define an autonomous world here. What you have as the state of your autonomous world in open source development is the code of your game. It has a lot of the same properties. It's decentralized. Git is essentially a blockchain. If we don't go into details too much, it's forever evolving data, so that's your state. The players of your games are the developers. They interact with it, they evolve it over time, and you don't really know what they want. When you're making an open source project, you have people coming in and you have no ideas if they're coming to contribute to your code base because they find it fun, because they have something they want to add, because they run into issues, or because they, hope to make money down the line and you haven't discussed this actually. The rules of your games, in the case of open source development, is where the parallel is the least good, is because it's social consensus. How the game evolves, so how the code base evolves, is based on the wants of developers and players, the constraints of tooling, how vision and time, dictated by the time that the developer have, will change the game. And the equivalent of TVL for an autonomous world, an on-chain game, is the actual number of players. That's what's hard to fork. If you have a game that has a reputation, people will flock to it. In the same way that TVL kind of gives you stickiness on-chain and is kind of your only moat. Well, for an open source game and for open source development, having actual players is the moat and is what most games don't actually achieve. So one thing you might be wondering about here is, well, I've been told that autonomous worlds should be immutable. maybe. Code is essentially immutable. That's the whole, purpose of it. And one of the things that I think this is actually an interesting question, because immutability is kind of a lie, even in autonomous worlds that are put on chain with immutable contracts. You can be forked, as I said, and if you get forked, the code of your game will be changed, and maybe players will change, and so your autonomous world will essentially have changed. But not only that, the people that are playing your game will change. The meta of your game will evolve over time, and so you might have completely unexpected interactions pop up. And you have a question of who is controlling those changes. So in an immutable autonomous worlds, you're essentially leaving that control entirely to the players and to future potential forkers. If you have a mutable autonomous world, which is basically EVE Online as described by Hilmar this morning, the developers have more influence, but not all of the influence either. And so one thing that's interesting is that if your autonomous world is fully open source, you can have a mutable but still godless development process, because you really don't have a single entity that controls anything that happens, because of the possibility that's always there, of being forked. And when I'm talking about just being open source, I'm down to also the tooling and the process. One of the big problems that you have when you're doing actual open source development without any kind of corporate entity backing you is that you have no money. And what no money gives you is that you have no way to actually put any actionable constraints on the other developers around you. So I have, other people in the 080 team. If I ask them to do something, they can say yes, and they can just not do it. And I can literally do nothing about it because we're not getting paid. There is no company. There is nothing forcing us to do anything. So any action that's taken by the DAO, which we act as, is essentially meaningless unless somebody actually agrees with it and wants to implement it in the code. We've voted on a ton of things and nothing's happened because, well, actually, nobody actually cared enough to do it. And one of the weird things about this is that time is everything. The people that have more time will write more code and will have more influence on the code base. And this is a problem when you get toxic developers. And we've had those in 080, which is why we ended up with a hard fork at one point. Some people want to control things. Some people think that there's only one good way to do things. Even if you try to filter them out at the beginning of your, recruitment process, whatever, they might still come up, and or people might change. You don't really know their motivation. And when you have people that have some level of control, they usually don't want to relinquish it. And if they have more time than you, they're going to beat you and they're going to implement their bad ideas instead of, good ones. There's also a secondary problem with being a DAO and trying to develop a game, which is that you don't have a benevolent dictator, and actually designing gameplay, and this is where I tie back to what Will was saying, designing gameplay is extremely hard, and it's extremely hard to do this iteratively. This is what I call the gradient descent of gameplay. You have a gameplay, you have players, you don't really know what kind of change is going to improve the fun. You don't even have a really good metric for that, and you have a ton of different users that might be playing your game. So what if you make a change? How do you test out that change? Do you just change your game? But then maybe, people won't like it, and instead of telling you that and allowing you to roll by, they're just going to go away, and you're just going to, lose players. Do you fork yourself? And then you fracture your user base. And if you're doing an MMO, or in our case, an RTS, we don't want to fracture the ranked ladder because there's going to be fewer players, and so the experience is going to degrade. That's really hard. Another thing that not having a benevolent dictator gives you, that since you don't really know where to go, you want to ask your users, but users are horribly wrong about what they want in games. They're horribly wrong about what is fun in a game. And the few users that do give you feedback tend to not be the most representative, which, is also why they're horribly wrong about what's fun in a game. If you want more details on that, you could just ask me directly. I don't want to get too much into it, but we have a suggestion thread on the 080 forum. It's 50 pages long. There's not a single good idea in there. It's actually crazy. And so dealing with the community is also terrible. I wrote lowering standards until morale improves. Yeah, mods are cool. Mods are a great way to balkanize your game and fracture your user base. Supporting once you have mods, you need to support the API for these mods. This is also sometimes very, very annoying when you have a feature that you want to remove, but they depend on. Gives you also a ton more maintenance to do. Trolls thrive off lack of moderation. So you can't be, you're facing the paradox of tolerance constantly. You need to ban people, but you need to be transparent about why you're banning people, which is why all of the open source projects started doing, community guidelines, code of conducts. And as we've seen with the Rust Foundation, that doesn't really work out all that well. There's still a ton of problem. Being transparent about open source development is actually weirdly hard because you don't want to be completely transparent, or you're going to be criticized for the process of finding an idea or trying to work out a new development. And you don't want people to ask questions about those because honestly, it just becomes too annoying. But if you don't show some of that, you're also going to run into the issue that people will go, well, why did you decide this? So it's very tricky. And the biggest and final problem is dealing with time. And this is one of the weird things that are very similar between open source developments and autonomous worlds, is that, well, the time horizon is infinite. People have been talking all day about this is going to live forever. And this means that your game needs to be fun in 500 years, not in 10 years, which is weird. And you can win by being last, not by being first. You can take your own time. Immutability changes nothing here, as I said earlier, because users will change. So you need to think about, is this going to be fun in 500 years? And that's a question that I think you're probably not equipped to deal with because, you'll be dead. Well, maybe. Things could change there. And you also have some hard questions about forgetfulness, privacy. You want people to be able to play your game and not feel like, somebody's going to come in 30 years and find out when now they're a politician and they want their past erased or something. So time horizons in open source games and in autonomous worlds are weird. And yeah, I think this is one of the big things, try to win by being last, maybe. That's a more productive approach, but you need to realize that you need to set up if you want to make a company to do that, 20 years is a long time and you need budget. And so, yeah, my post-assembly question is, how can we do open source, completely godless open source development better? To be honest, my answer is, boy, I wish I knew. But I hope some of you will have some better ideas than me about this.